I am Meg Boeni. My advisor is the incredible Davida Pines, who is coming in now, and also honorable mention to, thank you. Also honorable mention to Professor Jonathan Zatlin, who lampooned me earlier in his opening remarks, as he did all of us. So this is the part where I justify the fact that while everyone was compiling their analytical data and spending countless hours in the lab and writing their 18-page papers, I was drawing pictures. So my project, in a nutshell, is a nonfiction comic about a condition called synesthesia. Those are two very big concepts, nonfiction comic and synesthesia, that I will talk about both of. But the idea was to make a journalistic project in a non-traditional form. So I'm a journalism and also a Spanish literature major, and this is very tangential to both those things. But synesthesia is a neurological condition of so-called crossed senses. So it's a sensory perception condition that affects the five senses, as well as a concept of time, even personalities, and pain and temperature. And it is lifelong and consistent. So synesthesia results in things you may have heard of, like being able to see musical sounds in color, or experiencing smells as textures or colored letters of the alphabet. It affects about 1 out of every 25 people, about 4% of the population. So that's roughly 26,000 people in the Boston area. And part of my work was finding out where they were and how they lived their lives. A lot of media coverage of synesthesia tends to focus on the wow factor and how sparkly the idea of seeing Mozart in lime green can be. But what I wanted to focus on was how this affects people on a daily basis, their career choices, their personal relationships, even hearing the sound of the bell as you cross the street. So, why a comic for this? I could have done this in a fresh air NPR radio format. I could have written a journalistic article, but instead I chose the medium of nonfiction comics. It's a relatively colorful topic that is sometimes hard to explain in words, so I chose a colorful medium. Can you all hear me? Okay, thank you. The genre of nonfiction comics is about 35 years old. Just brief historical background. It started in the 1980s with Art Spiegelman, who is the author of Mouse. Mouse is a comic book, but it was one of the first nonfiction comic books. It's the author's story of his father's experiences in Dachau concentration camp during World War II. And it took the world by storm because it let people know that this medium of the Flash and Superman and Captain America could be used for serious topics and serious moving and historical stories. So the most important part of what I'm doing is not necessarily comics or the topic itself, but the storytelling. After Art Spiegelman, comics journalism has gone to places all over the world, including places where photography or other forms of reporting might not be allowed or possible. Guy Delisle is a French photojournalist who ended up doing a comic on Pyongyang, North Korea, where he could not take photos from the government. Marjane Satrapi is one of my favorite authors who wrote about the Iranian Revolution as seen by a little girl. And Joe Sacco is a comics journalist whose comics have leads and have headlines and quotations from eyewitness sources, just like any article in the New York Times. So, my background in serious comics started freshman year during a KHC seminar called Serious Comics, where we started with Mouse, Art Spiegelman's book, and from there went on to comics about the bombing of Hiroshima, about 9/11 and the flooding after Hurricane Katrina. And the end of the semester was a project to make our own serious comic, and mine ended up being about Harry Houdini, the great magician who visited Boston in 1908 and jumped off the Harvard Bridge. So this is the only formal art project I've really undertaken since middle school. That was 4 years ago, and from now I moved on to my Keystone project. So the process of doing any journalistic investigation starts with research. So for me, that research was many, many topics and many, many branches that came together to form this project. I started with the history of the study of synesthesia. The neuroscientific basis is still not completely understood. It's believed to be genetic. So there are parts of that in the comic. Also, artistic inspiration. Many famous synesthetes in history have been artists, from writers to painters to sculptors. And the influence of all of that on culture and how synesthesia is represented in the general public. Besides that, there's lots of little things: Peruvian shamans, LSD, poetry, online surveys, Mozart, Kandinsky. My writing process involves unconscionable amounts of sticky notes and tiny pieces of paper that all come together to form one thing in the end. So, after that, there were interviews. My 3 primary synesthetes, whose words and stories are included in the book, are Thomas, who is a professional clarinet player in the Boston area and teaches music in Brookline, Anna and Amy, who are both BU students in the College of Fine Arts studying respectively music education and visual art. And all three of them had just vibrant, unique perspectives that I was really excited to bring to fruition in this comic format as real stories. So outlining was the next logical step, and I hope these are visible. It's a lot of scribbling and a lot of little tiny pictures, but some people have asked me whether the words or the pictures came first in a comic, and the answer is that's like asking whether the words or the music come first when you're writing a song. It all just came together organically in a lot of scribbling and re-scribbling and erasing and re-scribbling. But after that was finally drawing, and the research and outlining process took me about a year. Drawing was 3 or 4 months. I should have allowed longer for it because it was much more grueling than I thought it would be. I have no computer artistic background, so it is all hand-drawn in mixed media with rulers. I used mostly pen and ink and watercolor pencils, if anybody's curious about the medium. And I also included some pages from the comic. This is the opening. I'm influenced by literary journalism as well, the genre that includes authors like Tom Wolfe, like Hunter S. Thompson, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, that is nonfiction and heavily researched and reported, but also personal, also narrative in nature. So I have synesthesia myself. Some of the pages include depictions of songs that I've been listening to or my experience and view of the world. And I'm the narrator, more or less. It is a text-heavy comic. There is nary a pop or a flash or a bang that you might be used to seeing in other graphic novels because it is nonfiction, and I wanted to do the topic justice. And paramount to all of that was representing the people. These are Amy and Anna that you saw in photographs, and their stories and their view of the world in real quotes and interpreting them in a way that was faithful to reality. If anyone is interested in seeing the comic, I do have a copy of it, and we'll be putting it outside for you to look at later. But I didn't want to steal the thunder of the poster people or the robot. It will be next to the robot. And now that drawing and everything is finished, all over but the shouting, the process is to print this comic. Right now, it is at the printer, and I am excited to hopefully eventually publish it officially and sell it in book form. Meanwhile, I'd like to take it to the Massachusetts Independent Comic Expo, which is a New England gathering of comics artists, and especially new comics artists. I've never really formally entered into the genre before, so I may end up doing it as a career in the future, but comics as a profession is exhausting and time-consuming and very difficult to pay your rent, so we'll see what happens. But hopefully look for a website in the near future of my nonfiction comics work. We shall see. But a final thought for that, some people ask me what the story of the comic was in the end, and because it is nonfiction, it doesn't have a clear beginning, middle, and end that you might think of for a graphic novel. But what I took away from it in general, talking to the synesthetes and doing all my research, was that we don't all see the universe in the same way. And that is more important than the science, more important than the history, and more important than the art. It's about individual perspective and how we can share that with each other. And so this is a quote from researcher Simon Baron-Cohen, who is one of the most influential writers on synesthesia. And aside from inspiring fellow researchers, his book and his research will do much to educate the general public about the important but often overlooked point that we do not all experience this universe in the same way, whether that's tasting purple or smelling Mozart or just walking around experiencing life. So, thank you very much. Questions?
Did you feel vulnerable sort of working through this project as someone who is a synesthete and sort of telling your story? How did that come across?
I did. More than vulnerable, I was afraid of being biased because my synesthesia is not the point of the story. It is the people that I talk to. But I didn't feel that I could just completely not mention it because that wouldn't be reflective of who I am and how I came to this position to write about it. But yeah, it was very, very personal in a way. And I couldn't completely remove myself from it. So, anyone else?
Did you find that you had the same style writing this project as you did the Harry Houdini one, or do you think the style of the comic changes with the subject matter?
Not at all. I'm a huge believer in that your medium should reflect what you're telling. And the Houdini comic was actually inspired by silent films of the period, which is a whole different aesthetic. But this one was really focused on color, and that inspired what I was doing on every page. It's mostly in black and white with selective pieces of color. So the style ended up being very, very different. Yeah. No questions?
How did you go about picking the 3 people?
That was a bigger part of my project earlier on than it ended up being in the end, but I actually made a flyer looking for synesthetes and posted it all over Boston and expected I would have maybe 25 people or 10 people and I could include them all in this comic, and I got 3. So they are all in the comic, but it was more difficult to come in contact with people who wanted to be a part of this than I thought it would be.
Have the synesthetes that were in your project seen the comic? I'm just curious about like how like they react, especially because you do use so many colors and it's very vibrant. How that they reacted to that.
It's interesting. Synesthetes usually have arguments about what things are what color, or at least diplomatic discussions. So they've been informed on the process all along and are generally pretty excited to be drawn and be drawn into this comic. So I'll be giving them copies of it soon as it comes back from the printer.
So do these people have any difficulty participating in society? Is there some difficulty that they often face?
That's a good question. Synesthesia is believed to be genetic, and what have been studied as possibly linked traits are confusion with basic math, for one thing, and left-right directional confusion. So I have the directional sense of like a blind cat, and I found that other synesthetes have similar problems. One of the people I talked to also, her sound to color was so overwhelming that she couldn't eat lunch in the cafeteria of her high school because the sensory overload was too much for her. Just little simple things like that can be problematic sometimes, but what I found was that most people who have synesthesia would not trade it for anything. They would not get rid of the small problems. So, any other questions?
Is there a way where you can get a copy?
Yes. So I'm printing relatively few right now for the first printing, but I'm definitely going to keep printing more, and we will see how big this gets. But yeah, if you'd like a copy, please talk to me afterward, and I will write your name down. So a couple of you mentioned that. Yeah.
Is there any objective test for diagnosis of this condition?
That's a good question too. A lot of these things are addressed in the comic, and I didn't have time to talk about all of them. But there is no diagnostic test right now because a lot of the reports on synesthesia and other than straight fMRI studies are biased by the fact that it is self-reported. And there is something online called the Synesthesia Battery, if anyone's interested, by a researcher who actually created a form of online test. It's multiple tests to determine whether you have simple things like colored months of the year, colored musical sounds, colored letters of the alphabet. And it's a rudimentary test, but it's not foolproof. I invite you to check it out if anyone's curious. Okay, thank you very much.